Now, it goes without saying that when the Torah says that we should wear these words as a reminder, the Torah means these words. Which words? These words, the sections of the Torah that mention the mitzvah of tefillin. So you can understand that in order for the writing to say the words in the Torah, the letters have to be clearly legible and easily identified as the intended letter. And this is where you start to run into problems with the lesser expensive and the cheaper tefillin, because they're not written as nice. And when something's not written as nice, or worse, it's written sloppy, then you can have a serious problem with the tefillin being considered kosher, because it wouldn't be the intended word that the Torah says that needs to be there. So for example, just to use the hand tefillin here, the first word of the parsha that goes into the tefillin is vayidaber. So imagine if the Sofer wrote the daled not so neat, and instead of making it a sharp and a proper daled, it was rounded at the back, and now the daled will look just like a resh, so it doesn't say vayidaber anymore. I'm not sure how you would pronounce that word. Definitely wouldn't say vayidaber. And then, of course, the tefillin would not be kosher because it doesn't have the letters that the Torah says need to be there inside the boxes and be worn every single day. So this leads me into the next thing that I want to talk about, is that everybody knows that a Sofer needs to be a Yirei Shomayim, which means somebody who has the fear of heaven, somebody who has an awareness, a consciousness of Hashem. Why is this so important that the Sofer be a Yirei Shomayim? Like I explained to you how the letters all have to be written perfectly and exact, there's another law which applies to the mitzvah of tefillin. I mean, there are several thousand laws that are necessary for the Sofer to know when it comes to writing the letters for the tefillin. But one of the basic laws is that the writing of the tefillin has to be done in sequence. It has to be written in order. So when you see the word vayidaber over here, it has to say vav, yud, daled, beis, resh. Now, if the Sofer, in the previous example which I gave you, instead of making a daled, wrote a resh, and then he only realized when he finished the entire word vayidaber, you can't simply erase this daled, which looks like a resh, and rewrite the daled and then continue on writing. Because what happened is now this daled was written after the beis and the resh was here. So the proper way to fix that is to erase the resh, erase the beis, rewrite this daled proper, and then write the beis, and then write the resh again. You know, when you realize your mistake 3 letters later, it's not that big a deal to make the correction. But let's say, you know, even if you go one word further, you have Hashem's name, now that would be a mistake that can't be fixed anymore, because you can't erase Hashem's name, and you can't write the daled out of sequence. So now you have this piece of parchment would have to be buried. So that's an expense. The cost of the parchment is not cheap. It does cost a couple of dollars. But think about a much different scenario. Let's say the Sofer didn't realize that they made the mistake until they finished writing all 4 of the sections from the Torah. Now, just like each letter has to be written in sequence, each parsha has to be written in sequence also. So imagine the Sofer didn't realize the mistake until the end. Now, this takes many, many, many hours to write, and we'll get into that more towards the end of the video. But can you imagine the test of faith that this requires, of hours of your week? Hundreds of dollars and perhaps over $1,000 can be at stake from one letter being written incorrectly. So you really have to trust the Sofer who's writing the tefillin, that if they discover a mistake like this, that they're able to withstand the temptation to just make that small correction, and nobody would be the wiser, because to erase that letter and rewrite it, any Sofer that knows how to write also knows how to erase, can simply make that correction, and it will be undetectable to the eye. Even if I was to get that this tefillin, a month later to examine it, I wouldn't even think to suspect that this resh was changed into a daled out of sequence. So who would know? The only person who knows is the Sofer, his desk, his lamp, and Hashem. And because of this is so much is at stake, you have to really trust your Sofer. I mean, some of the Sofrim that I buy from, they are so nervous about making a mistake, they actually do a computer examination. They don't wait till they finish writing the entire tefillin to do a computer examination. They do a computer examination after each section that they wrote. So they'll write it, they'll let it dry, they do a computer checking, then they also do a manual check to make sure that it's okay, and then they go further. So that's one of the basic reasons why we say that a Sofer has to be a Yirei Shomayim, because you have to trust them that they're making the tefillin 100% according to halacha and how Hashem wants the tefillin to be made. So I think that should give you just a general idea of why the sofer has to be Yirei Shomayim, and not just the sofer who is writing the tefillin, but also the sofer who is checking the tefillin, and the sofer who's preparing the tefillin for you, because just like the sofer can make a mistake like that, either because they don't have Yirei Shomayim, or because they're not knowledgeable in the halachos of what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. We're going to talk about what exactly Yirei Shomayim is in a couple of minutes, but it's not just limited to the sofer. It also applies to anybody who puts their hands on these tefillin. Has to be a Yirei Shomayim, because there's so many aspects of, you have to really care and invest yourself in making these tefillin to make sure that they are 100% right. I mean, they could be written properly, but not assembled correctly, or the person who checks it makes a correction that he wasn't supposed to make. So everybody that is involved in the process of making this tefillin, from when it leaves the sofer's hand till it gets to your hands, you have to trust every single person along the process of the tefillin, and it basically boils down to the person who you're actually buying the tefillin from, that they trust all the people that were involved in the process of making the tefillin, because it's impossible for you to be in touch with every single person, from the making of the batim to the parshios to the assembling it, checking it, and the one doing the computer checking and all these things. You would be surprised how many sofrim, I'm not even talking about Judaica stores and gift shops, sofrim sell tefillin that they just skip the computer examination. All of my sofrim, I make sure they do a computer examination on the Parshios. You'd be surprised. I know, because I know because I've had stories where I buy Parshios from sofrim, and I know that other sofrim, like I'll call them like myself, who are not writing but are assembling tefillin, buy from the same sofer tefillin. I make sure that it's computer checked before we do a manual check and before I give it to any one of my clients. But I know some sofrim who buy from the same sofrim, and I know that the sofer doesn't do a computer examination, so that's why I have to do it. They take a shortcut, they don't do it. And I have stories where people give me a tefillin to check, and I say, oh, I recognize this ksav I also get from this sofer, and I'll find a letter missing, and I'll be like, why didn't they do a computer examination? I mean, that would have found it, right? So it's very important to, you have to trust the sofer who wrote it. Anybody can make a mistake. Anybody can miss a word or a letter. That's possible. There's distractions today. Nobody's perfect. But that's why you also have to trust the sofer who's preparing it for you. They're doing a computer examination. They're making sure it's checked over by another sofer, not by the sofer who wrote it, because a sofer can't find his own faults. It has to be somebody, an independent sofer who's checking and wants to make sure that the tefillin are perfect. You have to have somebody overseeing the process of putting the parshios into the batim, making sure they're wrapped properly, make sure they're putting in properly, making sure that the parshios not put into the batim too tight that would squish it and eventually hurt or ruin the parshios. Painting the batim, sanding the batim, making sure the batim aren't getting ruining the squareness of the tefillin. Basics, things like measuring batim, making sure that they're ribua and that it's being done by somebody who has experience, knows what they're doing. These are all things which fall into my domain as the one who's assembling and preparing the tefillin. And I need to make sure, and you have to make sure, that the person you're buying the tefillin from is making sure that everything is done 100% according to halacha. If you walk into a Judaica store to buy a pair of tefillin, so there's a lot of barriers between the store clerk and the manager, the one that does the orders, the Judaica supplier that supplies the tefillin, and in most cases, the tefillin comes to the Judaica store already assembled, and then just marking it up and passing it on to the customer. They don't know what's inside over there. They don't know who wrote it. They don't know what style the writing is. They're selling the tefillin like any other Judaica item, like a menorah, for example. It doesn't take much for a menorah to be kosher. If it has a scratch or a ding on it or something, is not 100% perfect, it still fulfills the mitzvah. It's still kosher. A tefillin, however, as you are starting to get the idea, I hope, and you definitely will have the idea as we finish this video, tefillin are much more, if you watch all the series of my guide to buying tefillin, you will understand that tefillin has to be much more, there's much more that can go wrong throughout the process of making a pair of tefillin, and you really have to have proper oversight, and you have to make sure that the person that's providing it with you knows what's going on, knows where it came from, understands your needs, what you need, and is able to provide that with you because they themselves understand what goes into the process of making a pair of tefillin, which a store clerk cannot provide that for you.